So we're back to David's story, and 2 Samuel 22 actually reads like a psalm, and it is actually described as a psalm of deliverance, and is identical to the one David composed after his victories when he was enjoying a period of success. The 2 Samuel 8, and is actually identical to Psalm 18. It describes David's personal relationship with God and gives meaning to the entire history recorded in 1st and 2nd Samuel. We're approaching the end of David's life, and this psalm was placed here to show the period of redemption and instability was over, and David was resting on God's promises. And looking forward with confidence, in verse 9, he uses poetic imagery to describe God's activities, revealing God's majesty, righteousness, and power. He speaks a lot about his righteousness, that's David's righteousness, but we know that he didn't mean that he was sinless or blameless. He acknowledged, like he did before, that it was a gift from God. He confessed his wrong and had been forgiven, and that was that. It was God who made him and his ways blameless. In spite of his weaknesses, David made God's law his rule. And unlike Saul, his predecessors, he never bowed to any other gods or worshipped any other gods. He was cognizant of sin and lived humbly before God. And God delighted in him and delivered him. Even after his sin against Uriah and Bathsheba, God continued to show him favor. And even after Absalom's rebellion, we saw that he had favor by his triumphant return to Jerusalem. God's favor was evident even then. In 2 Samuel 23, even though this chapter is titled David's Final Words, he's not dead yet. We're still going to hear from him. But they were probably composed in the final years of his life and may have been his final words as a poet, inspired by God, but not like the final words he said before he went to his grave. He described his own relationship with God, indicated what made a good leader, and recalled God's promises to him of a dynasty. He starts by identifying himself humbly. He says, "I, David, son of Jesse," and recognizing the ways that God exalted him and protected him, and how God speaks to him and through him. He served as a prophet. He served as a prophet and a king to Israel. And in verse 5, he says, "Although my house is not so with God." Now, when I read that, I was like, what does that mean? But it actually translates to, "So lives my house with God, for he made me an everlasting covenant." He was referring to God's promise to him. But the fact is, neither David nor his sons lived up to the ideal of a king, but his life exemplifies what a perfect leader is able to achieve as long as they stay connected to God. God's promise to David of a dynasty wasn't predicated on the merits of him or his sons, but on God's grace and his presence in their lives. David's mighty men, the chapter ended with a list of David's mighty men, and David's mighty men were professional soldiers who stood by him his entire life. They were divided into 3 groups. The first 3 stood apart from others, because if you saw, they kept saying, "Oh, this person was greater," but he wasn't like the first 3, right? He wasn't among the first 3. And they stood apart for their outstanding feat. And they were leaders like Abishai and Benani, who were famous for their bravery. Also, to the 3 who broke through the camp. Remember in sometime in 1 Samuel, they broke through the Midianite camp to go to bring water for David from a well in Bethlehem that he had thirsted or had expressed longing for. And then finally, the final person that was And I mean, those ones, what they did showed their loyalty, right? And then the final person listed in that list was Uriah, who was loyal, but David was disloyal to him and betrayed him. Psalm 57, which was also part of this today's read, is a prayer of David for safety from his enemies when he fled from Saul into the cave. Now, there's speculation, is this the cave of Engadi? Is this the cave of Adullam? Is this when he was in the crag of wild goats? Nobody knows, but he was in one of those places. A lot of times in David's life, we've seen him crying out to God for help. He began here, like he had many other times, with a cry for mercy from God, whom he trusted, and he used familiar imagery to describe taking refuge in him. David has experienced God's acting on his behalf in the past, and he was confident of his deliverance from the present difficulties. So it wasn't anything new to him, and neither should it be to us, because truly most of David's psalms always starts with him, bemoaning, but then always trusting in God in the end. And I think that's one powerful lesson that I've learned throughout reading the Psalms of David. Now, here's my hashtag getting to know God lesson. God's gentleness is powerful. We don't often hear about God's gentleness. In 2 Samuel 22:36, David says, "Your gentleness has made me great." He was probably referring to how God showed him mercy in the midst of his sins. David recognized and also mirrored God's gentleness as a king because he was merciful. He was merciful to Mephibosheth. He was merciful to Saul. He pardoned Shimei and other of his enemies. And that, just mirrors God's gentleness. God is gentle with us. He's always showing us his mercy. And I think that the lesson here is that we should be like David, being gentle to others, showing gentleness, meekness, showing mercy to others. Gentleness is a fruit of the Spirit, and it should be evident to all. In Philippians 4:5, it says, "Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near." So as people who serve a gentle God, let us deal gently with each other. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where we'll be sharing lessons from Psalm 95, 97, 98, and 99. Have a good day. Bye.